Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Joanna, and thank you to and greetings to everybody at the Observatory. Thank you for the invitation, which honors me. It's a real pleasure to meet with your group. Normally in these webinars, I begin with a joke about how Australia is far ahead in terms of time zone. And so, by listening, you can look into the future and see what tomorrow looks like. But in this case, it sounds like you're looking 2 hours into the past because the time zone calculation meant that I left you hanging 2 hours ago. So I apologize for that. A bit of a mix up with time zones. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my thoughts and the work that I've been doing over the past year with you and hearing your comments and questions. I have been monitoring some of the key trends, as I'm sure have many of you, regarding human mobility and migration in the wake of the 2020 pandemic. And today I'm going to share some of my thoughts and my observations with you. And I think it's really important to begin a discussion like this by recognizing that issues of migration and mobility are really central to the pandemic and its impacts, whether we're talking about the spread of the disease itself, or the economic impacts, or the impacts on things like transport and infrastructure planning, or even areas like domestic violence, where you have an epidemic of domestic violence because people are locked up, unable to move out of their homes from each other. So a lot of what is going on right now in relation to the pandemic has to do with whether and how we move around in space. And there's probably never been a moment in history before when the entire human species has decided, more or less in unison, to stop any kind of movement, from walking to the shops, to commuting to work, to driving to the countryside, to visiting or moving to another country. And so the big question in many of our minds is this a temporary lockdown, a temporary trough in patterns of human migration mobility, or is it something bigger? Does it represent a structural change in the way migration happens? Can we talk about it as the end of an era, or the end of the post-war age of migration that's been talked about a lot? Is there something structural and epochal happening in migration mobility now? And the jury, of course, is still out on this. I always getting asked to talk about this a lot recently. And the first thing to emphasize, of course, is that making predictions about human society is always fraught, because the best thing about humans is they can change their mind. And so as soon as I make a theory about what you're going to do tomorrow, you can change your theory, you change your action to beat my theory. So humans can't be predicted in that way. So obviously the jury is still out about whether things will bounce back to what they were before, or whether there will be some kind of major shift. It relies on decisions that people are going to make in the future that they haven't made yet. So, there are limits to what we can predict. But having said that, there are a lot of things that we do know and that we can infer from current trends. So it's in that spirit that I share with you some of my thoughts today. I should just say, Inez or one of the panel, would you mind just keeping an eye on time and letting me know when you'd like me to stop talking?
Yes, perfect. Cool. Can I ask you to expand the presentation for us to see better, sure. Please? Thank you.
Can you see it now? Can you see the presentation slides now?
Yes, but not in a presentation mode.
Are you seeing, how about now?
Yes.
Right.
No, it's okay.
Okay, excellent. So let's begin with some of the things that we do know, and some of the things that we can maybe infer from that knowledge. One of the most famous books in research on human migration is called The Age of Migration by Stephen Castles. Mark Miller and Hein de Haas has recently joined the authorial team as well. And the argument of that book is that post-war migration is unprecedented in its complexity, its global extent, and its centrality to social transformations. And these figures that I'm showing here, which are from the United Nations, tend to support this view of post-war migration as historically unique. We've seen the net migration globally expand rapidly in the post-war period, particularly since 1990. And it's not just about migration, it's also about short-term mobility. For example, tourism has climbed from just 25 million arrivals worldwide in 1950 to 1.4 billion arrivals in 2018. So a 56-fold increase in that period. And all of that has come crashing down as a result of the pandemic. We're not sure how and when things will reopen. And so we're still in this moment of uncertainty, trying to think of what the future holds. And in that environment, I've tried to formulate a research agenda based around 10 key questions that I think we need to ask about what's going to happen next. And they are these 10 here. Will countries need less labour migration? Will migrant decision-making change? Will anti-immigrant sentiment grow? Will authoritarian regimes suppress diversity? Will migration restrictions proliferate? Will travel bubbles become economic regions? Will international student migration recover? Will commuter travel decline? Will immobility reshape our cities, and will demographic and mobility transitions change course? And I've been monitoring these trends in these areas since writing a working paper for the UN Migration Agency about this time last year on these questions, trying to gain some insight. And I'll give an overview of where I think things are at. So the first question is about demand for migration. Will countries need less labour migration? Will there be less demand? The underlying trend here is that during the pandemic, there's been a massive global loss of employment, a rise in unemployment. This is a chart from the ILO's recent report on COVID-19 and the world of work, which shows predicted 144 million employment loss. That's 144 million people's worth of employment loss as a result of the pandemic, compared with the scenario where there's no pandemic. So a massive unemployment effect of the pandemic. Firms that make it through this period of economic shock will be faced with a larger pool of native workers whom they can recruit from, and that will satisfy some of their demand and obviate to some extent the need to recruit immigrant labour. Not all workers obviously will be able to, native workers I'm talking about, will be able to retrain to take up the jobs that immigrants used to do. Many of those jobs will remain undesirable, or jobs that native workers don't have the skills to do, but there will be, and there already is, because of political trends that I'll also discuss, pressures for governments to, pressures from governments rather, for firms to hire native workers instead of bringing in migrants to do work. And so the net result of this massive surge in unemployment globally, with, obviously there's a geography to that. In some places it's worse than in others, but the net result is almost certainly going to be a period where economies are less dependent on immigrant labor to fill skills gaps and seasonal labor shortages, which is really the end of a trend that's been developing and growing for decades. So that change does suggest a structural change rather than a short-term trough. It's also really important to point out that, as well as there being an uneven geography of the unemployment effects of the pandemic, they fall unevenly across the labour market as well. So immigrants tend to be clustered in some countries, at least, in the low skill and very high skill jobs. The jobs that native workers can't do in the case of the very high skilled, and the jobs that native workers won't do in the case of the very low skilled. And so these tend to be jobs that are so-called essential work, for example, in healthcare, infrastructure maintenance, food production, and so forth. So there's a real geography of where the unemployment falls, but also a variation by sector of the economy. It doesn't fall evenly. And so that's going to have big implications for the way that essential jobs in the economy are done going forward. Let's change slides here. Another trend that may well lead to decreasing demand for immigrant labor is automation, which was, again, happening before the pandemic, but it's one of those things that the pandemic has acted as a trend accelerator for. The current inability of firms to recruit internationally to fill labor shortages, the lockdowns, in other words, have spurred a massive injection of investment in automation of various jobs and in the rise of the digital economy. It's raining cash in the tech sector. Tech stocks are up. The innovations that result from that investment, that thunderstorm of cash that's happened during the pandemic to the tech sector, is going to result in a whole wave of new innovations that turn into a cycle of making it easier to work more remotely, making more jobs automated, and that could easily result in the kind of structural change to the economy such as occurred during the Industrial Revolution with the mechanization of agriculture, when there was what the geographer Wilbur Zielinski called a great shaking loose of population from the countryside. So this large-scale structural unemployment as a result of automation is already here, and it's accelerated by the pandemic, and that will again further depress demand for immigrant labor in many current destination countries. Okay, so the second of these 10 questions that I'm interested in following is the question of whether migrant decision-making will change. So we've looked briefly at the demand side of immigration. Now let's look at the supply side in the decisions that migrants themselves make. Will that change somehow as a result of the pandemic? And again, we're in a period of uncertainty, but my prediction based on sort of theory and inference is that probably yes, they will change in at least two ways. So on the one hand, for the people who have more choice in their migration decisions, the more voluntary migrants, tend to be towards the higher end of the skills spectrum. These are the workers who governments allow to travel more freely. These are people who have the resources to exercise more agency in their migration decisions. They will, I think, for a sustained period, be less likely to migrate. And the logic there is that very interesting paper published last year by two economists, Michel Ben, who many of you will know as a well-known economist who works on migration, and Arnaud Dupuy. They compared the pandemic to the shock of earthquakes. And they observed that after earthquakes, when people are shocked, have experienced a trauma in that way, they change their decision-making in two ways. One, they become more risk averse. They're less willing to take a risk. And number two, they become more impatient about the time frame over which they expect their investment decision to yield a profit. So if we expect people to become more risk averse and more impatient as a result of the shock of the pandemic, it seems very likely that they'll be less likely to undertake a risky long distance move, which has a payoff over a period of years rather than weeks and months. So there's my reasoning for saying that probably at the voluntary, high skill, more choice end of the migration spectrum, there's going to be a wait and see kind of mentality amongst voluntary migrants. At the other end of the spectrum, however, I think we're probably going to see an increase in forced migration pressures. And that's where, we start with a health crisis, which, is managed less well. There's less cash going around to throw at the pandemic in developing countries, where low-skilled workers often come from. This health crisis has an economic impact, which ultimately becomes a development crisis. The developed world, as I said, has more money to invest in reducing the impact of the health crisis and shortening the length of the crisis as well. In developing countries, that's not the case. So the economic impact is extended, and it turns from a health crisis into a development crisis. From that, humanitarian situations that people were previously trying to escape worsen, partly because humanitarian actors aren't able to enter these humanitarian spaces because of the public health and economic crises. And as a result, pressure builds up in humanitarian situations, which were really bad for people to leave. And so I think we can see that happening around the world, that some humanitarian situations are getting worse as a result of this pandemic. Myself and a number of colleagues here in Australia have recently received funding from the Australian Research Council and Australia's cross-government humanitarian coordination agency, the Australian Civil and Military Centre, to conduct some research into the role of diasporas in humanitarian crisis spots. And some of the information we're getting is that the diasporas are more able to get access to these areas, which are really troubled, partly as a result of the mainstream humanitarian sector not being able to get in there. So I think there's going to be these two trends happening. One, with less migration happening at the choice end, more migration happening at the forced end. And as a result, we're going to see for the next year at least, I'm saying probably 3 years, maybe even more, some volatility, some non-linear changes where migration increases from unexpected places and decreases from unexpected places. And so migration becomes more difficult to predict as a result of these interacting changes. That's my prediction. Again, this depends on decisions that haven't been made, but I think we can make some inferences on the basis of trends we're already seeing, and we can extrapolate from theory. I think it's likely that we'll see a period of volatility. The third question I'm interested in keeping an eye on is, will anti-immigrant sentiment grow? There was, as soon as the pandemic hit, an immediate reaction of worry amongst those of us who study international migration that anti-immigrant sentiment would grow. We saw some troubling examples of that early on. For example, here in Australia, where I'm living, people of Chinese or Asian appearance were often being blamed for the pandemic. And then in retaliation, China issued a warning about international students coming to Australia, saying, you know, don't go there because you'll experience discrimination if you do. And there was sort of backlash, discrimination against foreigners in China. There was a video which went viral from an account called Black Liberty China, which showed a sign at a McDonald's restaurant in Guangzhou saying, notice, we've been informed that from now on, Black people are not allowed to enter the restaurant. For the sake of your health, please consciously notify the local police for medical isolation. Please understand the inconvenience caused. At least they were polite about their racism. So we saw these troubling instances very early on in the pandemic, and that caused some worry. And you can see here some results from a prominent survey here in Australia, really excellent longitudinal survey, which has been carried out for many years now. One of the questions asks about anti-immigrant sentiment, and we did see a bit of a rise of it in anti-immigrant sentiment in the early part of 2020, you know, corresponding to that period when everybody was worried about it. The survey showed higher responses to the question, have you experienced discrimination in the last 12 months because of your skin color, ethnic, or religion? Those answering yes numbered higher than they had the previous years. But interestingly, for the first time, this survey was, because it's changed mode into an online format, it was done twice in the same year for the first time. And the very interesting thing is that this actually dropped off really quickly, this anti-immigrant sentiment, and actually went down lower than it had been for a long time. And we can form various hypotheses about why that might be the case. Many people were writing in the middle of last year about sort of successful "we're all in this together" campaigns by various governments. In my part of the world, again, New Zealand was sort of held up as an example with the Prime Minister's slogan of you know, the team of 5 million and so forth. So this sort of sudden increase in social cohesion as a response to a shared threat might be a factor in explaining this somewhat surprising result. But it may be that the good news is only going to be short-lived. So this chart is also from the same report called Mapping Social Cohesion from the Scanlon surveys. And the lead author of the report is Andrew Marcus, who's also at Monash University. And what it shows here is that in the long term, anti-immigrant sentiment is highly correlated to unemployment, which has risen sharply, as I mentioned previously. And the attitudes that we observed in the previous slide are currently bucking the trend. That's the black downward line there. But it seems unlikely, given this long-term trend, that they will buck that trend in the long term. So there's been a reassuring resilience and social cohesion. We haven't seen the extent of rises in anti-immigrant sentiment as a result of this crisis that we might have expected, but because of the economic fallout, I think it's too soon to be over-optimistic about the long-term trend there, and we're really potentially in for a significant period of higher unemployment and therefore higher anti-immigrant sentiment. Just play a short video here on this question: will autocratic regimes suppress diversity? There's a great deal of fear about this also early on in the pandemic, including this PBS report from August in 2020.
There's an old saying, never let a crisis go to waste. And for some leaders around the world, the pandemic has been the crisis they've been waiting for. Pro-democracy groups say that authoritarianism was already on the rise before COVID-19. And as Nick Schifrin tells us, the pandemic has accelerated that trend.
So, as I say, this was a huge worry in 2020, and it relates to a long-standing related question, which was articulated really well a few years ago in 2017 by the political scientist Scott Walker, as follows: are governments in diverse societies more likely to use political repression against their citizens? So obviously there's sort of the opposite effect being, the opposite direction of causality being studied there. The question is, does diversity lead to authoritarianism? And as Scott Walker notes in this great 2017 paper, John Stuart Mill argued many moons ago now that diversity erodes the workings of representative government. He argued that, quote unquote, free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities. So it was inevitable, he thought, that diverse countries would become authoritarian, or that political authorities would need to use terror to control the population. But there was an interesting debate between Mill and Lord Acton in the period. Mill, as Scott Walker also notes, argued that diversity actually fostered democratic institutions because different cultures would act as checks and balances on each other's efforts to monopolize power, which he said would be, quote, an antidote to despotism and a civilizing influence besides. So there's this long-standing question about what's the relationship between diversity and authoritarianism. And this is, in a way, just sort of the latest chapter in that discussion. It's a long-standing puzzle and the jury's still out. We might have expected, based on the theory and based on the widespread worry that occurred early in the pandemic, that there would be authoritarian rulers taking advantage of the pandemic to cement control and cracking down on diversity that they saw as a threat to their authority. But it's important to note that in many cases, those fears haven't actually been borne out by the pandemic. For example, this year, a study was published by authors at the Max Planck Institute for Religious and Ethnic Diversity, which found that, quote, that using a quasi-experimental design where they surveyed people before and after the pandemic, they found that, quote, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic has not lowered the high level of assent to diversity in urban Germany. So, key destination country where we would expect some resistance to diversity to have emerged, as we see sort of the rise of AfD and, political populism in some of these Northern European countries. We would maybe expect to see in Germany some kind of resistance to diversity emerging in a situation like this, if it's the case that the pandemic is worsening authoritarianism and worsening its effect on diversity. But we don't seem to have seen that, which is a pretty interesting result. That's a study by Lucas, Druhot, Peterman, and Schonwalder, by the way, and I commend it to you.
There's an old saying, never let it...
Right. So the next question I'm interested in asking is, will migration restrictions proliferate? And let's here have a look at some data from the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, which is monitoring COVID stringency. So here, the first to close the border was China, where there was the virus was first discovered, and then that was followed by the announcement of the pandemic in March, and very quickly the whole world went blue. That means they had very stringent restrictions. In the middle of 2020, there was some opening up for the Northern European summer. You can see some of those countries lightening a little bit in the Northern Hemisphere. And then the opposite happened as we started to get into October, November. The Southern Hemisphere spring and summer started coming, and then they opened up. But there's also an interesting pattern emerging here where the developing countries, many of them opened up more in the middle of 2020, and they just didn't close down again, which suggests to some extent they didn't have the capacity to maintain lockdowns. Perhaps a lack of stimulus funding, lack of ability to cover unemployment insurance, which has been a big part of the pandemic response in developed countries, and so forth. So the costs of lockdown just became too high in many developing countries, and they had to open up, and they didn't close down again. So we see in this timeline that lots of places in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia just remained open after an initial period of lockdown. Meanwhile, the developed world, as I mentioned previously, has managed to maintain lockdowns because of their ability to throw money at the problem. And so that's, again, a clue to this future that a public health crisis is going to transform over the next few years into a global development crisis. The rich countries have been able to invest in a much shallower impact and a much quicker recovery, whereas the developing countries have sustained a much harder, much longer shock. We'll probably, in the developed world, be through vaccinations by late 2021, early 2022. Many developing countries won't have even started their rollouts by that time. So this question, will migration restrictions proliferate, is a really, really important one. We've looked at the lockdowns there, but the real question is it going to just be the lockdowns, or is there some longer structural change? Are we seeing an historical shift in the way countries manage migration? Are they going to move to a more closed environment? One of the factors there is seats infrastructure, global travel infrastructure, seats on airplanes. This is a chart from the International Civil Aviation Organization on the effects of COVID-19 on the aviation industry. It was published just a couple of days ago. And this is really not good for their industry. This is catastrophic. Talk about crash in the airline industry. So I think I remember reading last year, and don't quote me on this, I hope I'm not making this up, but hundreds of airlines globally, maybe tens will survive this shock. So massive, massive cataclysm for the aviation industry. As we can see, decline in world total passengers down by about half. Will this recover in time to save the airlines? Probably not in many cases. As a result, there's just fewer seats available for people to get to other countries. So in that sense, restrictions may proliferate, not in the sense that migration policies necessarily become more restrictive, but just in the sense that the corridors through which migration flows will be narrower. Another factor there, of course, is political will. And I've mentioned, again, a couple of times, the rise of anti-immigrant populism. This isn't something that's only happened because of the pandemic. The border walls were going up before the pandemic. The crisis of the migration crisis of 2015 was kind of a key milestone in this, but in many ways dates back to the global financial crisis. and the pandemic has just accelerated that trend of populist politicians rising to power in many countries around the world on anti-immigrant platforms, and calling for the closing up of the borders and the building of border walls. And the pandemic has given many of those types of politicians the excuse to really do what they wanted to do all along, which was radically cut migration, and then when it comes back, leave it at a much lower level. So I think I said this early on, and I still think this is probably accurate, that Steve Verdovic's prediction is probably a wise one, that we may start looking like Singapore in the developed world, where we've got a very tightly controlled guest worker system in destination countries that still rely on a certain amount of immigrant labor. When it comes to low-wage workers, and a more kind of open cosmopolitan system for higher skilled workers, we might end up with migration systems, migration control systems looking a bit more like that. Next question, will travel bubbles become economic regions? So, as I've said, the aviation industry has been a big casualty of COVID-19. The hospitality industry has followed. So tourism has absolutely plummeted. There was a massive expansion, of course, in cheap air travel in the post-war period, which has been the basis of the age of migration and the massive increase in global mobility. That's occurred since then, and the pandemic's just disrupted all of that. And the solution, although it's taken longer than initially expected, has been the rise of so-called travel bubbles. So I'm speaking to you from my home here in Australia, and in the other room are my children's grandparents who arrived here for the first time, since, I don't know, 14 months ago, because we've got a travel bubble with New Zealand now open. People can come across the border without the need for quarantine. Now, it's predicted that this might continue for quite some time before it opens up more broadly to include more countries. And as a result of that sort of longer term restriction in mobility, a number of economic commentators have started to predict the regionalization of supply chains and manufacturing processes and so forth. So this mobility bubble might become more of an economic region where supply chains and manufacturing are concentrated over time, and the sort of world-spanning extent of global trade may constrict for a period. So many people predicting a significant this may be a significant deglobalization event. So how are we doing for time?
13 minutes.
Okay. So next question, will international student migration recover? So international student migration, as all of us who are working in universities know all too well, has become a massive global industry in the last quarter of a century. Between 2001 and 2017, the global total of international students grew from fewer than 2.1 million people to over 5.3 million people. Of course, this is just the tip of an iceberg. It's the economic impacts of these people that has all these multiplier effects through the economy. A 2019 report estimated that annually international students spend US $300 billion, both in fees and also in living expenses, and indirect impacts such as creating jobs for the various people who service the providors and the landlords and all the various providers for international students, creation of jobs for those people, the administrators, counsellors, landlords, so forth. So there's this massive flow-on effect of the international student dollar. And then also there's the role that international students play in the labour market, because they often provide a flexible labour force to do many of the unskilled, dirty, difficult, dangerous jobs in hospitality, domestic care, and so forth, construction, seasonal labour, that are, you know, the hallmarks of the immigrant economy. And that's what's propped up our higher education model in the developed world for, you know, a quarter of a century now, is international student fees. And the pandemic has undermined that. There's many colleges across the developed world failing. There's massive job cuts in many universities across the developed world because of this drop in export income from international students. But it's not all bad news. On the other hand, we've developed the remote learning model that's expanded massively, and really interesting things have started to happen. I teach a course here at Monash on international development, and I have many students in my class who are zooming in from developing countries, and that adds another really pertinent dimension to the classroom that never would have been possible prior to the pandemic. And that was really brought home last night in a class. You know, we were talking about education and development in Bangladesh and the impact that the pandemic had had on the education sector in Bangladesh. And one of the student groups that was presenting, you know, had a woman from Bangladesh who runs a small NGO there focused on education. Her father had been an education activist, and he just passed away the previous day from COVID. The student herself had COVID, came along to the classroom to participate in this case study. And, you know, obviously quite a traumatic experience for many of the students involved in the class, but also a really visceral illustration of the issues that we were studying in the class, a real direct learning that was simply impossible prior to the pandemic. So really, really interesting, the rise of this remote learning model. Related to that kind of question is the question of whether commuter travel in cities is going to decline as a result of the rise of remote work and distance socializing. And we are certainly seeing this happen. I'm seeing graphs like this. This is from the USA. The trips per day over time from December 2018 to March 2021. I'm seeing similar patterns in data from all around the world, where we had, you know, very high traffic, commuter traffic going into the pandemic, and then plummeting commuter patterns at the height of the lockdowns, and then a very significant recovery, but a recovery that's sort of 20% down on what it was before. So it looks like it's bouncing back, but really we've still got 20% less commuting happening in cities. Obviously, this has massive implications for all of the businesses that rely on foot traffic in the middle of cities, all of those restaurants, art galleries, movie theaters, entertainment areas, shops, supermarkets. Everyone who relies on foot traffic going into central cities is feeling the pain right now. That has a flow-on effect to commercial real estate. We've seen massive drops in rental prices for accommodation in central cities. In many cases, businesses who, you know, have held sort of 10 floors on a $150 million high rise in the center of a city, deciding, okay, we're not going to renew our lease on those 10 floors. We're going to move to a more remote work model. And there's 10 floors that the owner of that $150 million high rise needs to rent out in order to service their borrowing that they made in order to build that high rise. And in order to do that, they have to get a holiday from the bank. And in the meantime, they drastically reduce their rent in the hope that the property price will recover and that they won't have to sell and take a massive haircut, take a massive loss on the price. As the holidays on mortgages start to bite and people don't have those holidays anymore, we'll see those prices drop. Another factor that is spurring that even more is, sorry, I'll skip over this slide because I've already kind of talked about it, is the rise of satellite towns, peri-urban areas where people are moving for lifestyle reasons now as a result of being able to work from home. So, you know, this is going to have structural impacts on cities. The center of the city is going to change. It already is changing. We need to seriously ask whether we're going to see the re-emergence of something like what was once called urban decay in the 1970s and 1980s, whether there's some sort of generational change in the use of the CBD as a result of these changes in the way that work happens. Finally, there's a question whenever mortality is concentrated very strongly in a specific age cohort, about whether demographic transition and mobility transition more broadly will change long term. I have a friend and colleague in the US, Ashby Monk, the director of the Global Project Center at Stanford University, who recently I saw was writing about reductions in premiums by premiums from pension funds as a result of the pandemic. So, you know, so many elderly people dying that the others, you know, get lower premiums because there's not as many people to pay out the annuity. So these discussions are going on in the pension fund world. So the underlying trend here is if the pandemic devastates a specific generation, it's going to affect the long-term dependency ratios and the dynamics of demographic transition that depend on those dependency ratios. It could reduce the proportion of elderly people in the population, which brings down the cost of aged care. You know, at one point, people were predicting a boom of babies conceived in the pandemic, although, you know, here in Australia, people have started talking more about an epidemic of divorces, people who have been locked together for months on end. We also know that age is directly related to migration, as in the standard age migration schedules, which I'm showing here, and also indirectly through its interaction with fertility, mortality, and the process of industrialization. And so by nudging mortality and birth rates, COVID-19 may have some more profound cohort effect, a sort of COVID-19 generation effect on the inputs to population growth, to socioeconomic development in ways that really complicate, maybe even reverse some of the prevailing trends that we're seeing in particular places. So again, back to the question at the beginning, is this a short-term blip, or is this something more structural, the end of a post-war age of migration? And I want to suggest a little bit whimsically at the end here that we're shifting to something that I'm thinking of as suspended globalization. When we mention the word suspend, we mean it in two senses. One means to temporarily prevent something from continuing or being in effect, being in force. But there's also another meaning where we hang something from somewhere, we suspend it. And I think we can ask a question of the current predicament based on both of those meanings of the word suspend. One is, you know, when we look at meaning one, are we experiencing a temporary suspension, a trough in globalization, such as the troughs that occurred in cross-border movements in the early to mid 20th century? But also in the second sense of the word suspend, are we witnessing the birth of a new kind of virtual or suspended globalization, which is based on a more distanced model of social life, where, you know, social ties and connections are suspended over great distances, and people live in a more distributed way on the face of the planet, without losing some of the connections that are built up as a result of globalization over recent decades. I think that would have some pretty profound effects, for example, on the future of the sustainable economy, the way that we interact with the environment and with the planet. If we can learn to have a globally connected society, not retreat into a kind of more gated globe, but at the same time have fewer people flitting around on airplanes, fewer people living in environmentally unsustainable cities, and so forth. So I'll finish there. I really look forward to some questions and comments and discussion. Thanks for listening.